Welcome to the Integrated Schools Podcast. I'm Andrew, a white dad from Denver.
And I'm Val, a black mom from North Carolina.
And this is White Rage Revisited. And listeners, you were probably not expecting to hear from us today. We are dropping into your feed with a special bonus episode just 6 days away from the election coming up. We thought we'd revisit this conversation with Dr. Carol Anderson.
That's right. One of our most important guests, especially when we talk about multiracial democracies. I feel like she is our resident expert in those things. And I'm just grateful that we can still learn from it because it is still so relevant to the conversation.
Yes. So this episode originally came out in March of 2022, but we thought we would go back and revisit it because, yes, you said it really feels very prescient.
So this is a look back. Warning. I was early in my podcasting days. I'm pretty sure I had a can and a little string attached to it, and I was trying to podcast.
Your audio was not up to the caliber it is now. That's for sure.
It was not. It was not the award-winning audio that it is today.
That's right. That's right. So we're going to play a lightly edited version of that original episode and then come back with some new reflections. If you remember this one well, you want to just jump straight ahead to that. It's around 55 minutes in.
So please press play, listen, and keep listening until the end.
All right. We'll see you on the other side. Val, I am not excited for this one.
Wow.
I'm totally excited.
Right? It's hard not to be excited to be in the same virtual space with the Dr. Carol Anderson. It was great to have one of my favorite teachers on to talk to us. And I continue to learn so much from her and her work with every conversation.
Yeah. So for anybody who doesn't know Dr. Carol Anderson, she is the author of White Rage. White Rage is a book that actually, if I'm being totally honest, I initially dismissed a little bit because I thought that it was going to be another book about white people's feelings about anti-racism work. And finally, my sister actually was like, you really have to read this book. And it blew my mind.
Yeah, you were definitely wrong on that one.
I could not have been more wrong. I was totally wrong about the book. And what she writes is that white rage is not about visible violence, but rather it works its way through the courts, the legislatures, and a range of government bureaucracy. It wreaks havoc subtly, almost imperceptibly, too imperceptibly, certainly, for a nation consistently drawn to the spectacular. It is not the Klan. White rage doesn't have to wear sheets, burn crosses, or take to the streets. Working the halls of power, it can achieve its ends far more effectively, far more destructively.
White rage happens in response to Black excellence, to Black folks working outside of the stereotypical lane that they are supposed to be in. And white rage is brutal.
Yeah.
It's a must read. It's a must share. And so I'm really glad that we're talking about it and sharing it with the integrated schools community and broader audience.
Yeah, she has a gift for making really complicated things really easy to understand, such that all of a sudden you find yourself enraged and you don't really know how it happened. I think her definition of white rage, I mean, it's hard, and it feels a little easier to wrap my mind around today. But this book came out in May of 2016. Like, this book came out before Donald Trump was elected. And, and afterward, at the end of the book, she anticipates Donald Trump and says, like, this is white rage. This is what's coming. This is what happens in response to a Black president, in response to the civil rights movement, in response to the Brown v. Board decision, in response to Reconstruction. This is what happens.
I'm pretty sure I read it in 2016, if not early 2017. And it felt like she was definitely being clairvoyant, right? It's like, wow. And if we think right now about book bans and the anti-CRT, being a response to what I believe the widespread support and anti-racism protests that happened in the summer of 2020, right? So we have all of these people, not just Black people, but a multiracial coalition of people out here talking about racism and what they're against. And so now the rage looks like, well, we can't keep teaching them this stuff because then they'll be out in the streets protesting again, right? So that is how I am seeing white rage today.
Yeah. It is still going on today. It is still so relevant. And she was so prescient in naming it. And she's just such a joy to talk to because she's brilliant and packs so much density into it and also easily moves right into things like hair invoke democracy, which came and went in the episode. And I was like, yeah, totally. And then I was like, oh, I have no idea what she's talking about.
We know that.
Let me go hit the internet. And sure, as it turns out, Herrenvolk democracy, Herrenvolk as the German nation is considered by the Nazis to be innately superior to others. And a Herrenvolk democracy is a system of government in which only a specific ethnic group participates in government while other groups are disenfranchised.
So sweet and sassy, all in the same package.
Whew. Listen,
I love it.
So we should probably take a listen.
We should probably take a listen. Take notes, y'all. You'll need them.
Hi, I'm Carol Anderson. I'm the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. I'm a historian, and I've written several books. The most prominent, I believe, is White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide. I've also had One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. And my latest book is The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America.
Yeah, just the titles alone.
I know.
Do you ever sleep? Because those have all come out in the past, 4 or 5 years.
Right, while I was chairing the department.
Wow.
So that's a no. You don't sleep.
Right. I do not recommend it. I do not recommend it. But I felt the fierce urgency of now.
Right.
The kind of crisis that this nation is in and how illegible the forces were that had brought us to this point. And one of my gifts is making the illegible legible. And so I stepped into that realm to make these things like, well, how did that happen? How did Philando Castile die? Why did he die? How did Donald Trump win the election? How is it that we had the election of Barack Obama where we had we have crossed the racial Rubicon. We have overcome. Woo! Right? How did 2 elections then lead to the election of Donald Trump? And I smelled Donald Trump coming in White Rage. The 2016 election hadn't occurred yet. But in that epilogue, I start off with him. I knew what White Rage looked like. The absolute anger that African Americans had advanced so far. So there was this rage that there was a Black man and a Black family in the White House. Rage that he was competent. Rage that they could not find a scandal. Lord, they looked.
He did wear that tan suit. I mean, that was.
And he had Grey Poupon mustard, right?
Right.
And they were hunting. And they couldn't find anything that was scandalous that fit into that stereotype of Black corruption, Black criminality, of Black incompetence. They couldn't find anything of that substance. And so that rage manifested itself. And when you think about that 2016 election, there were 15, 16 Republican candidates in the primary?
Yeah, there were.
Many of whom had legislative experience, policy-making experience, governing experience, and then there was Trump. Yeah. And what he had was a kilo of pure, uncut white supremacy that he put on the table and said, snort.
Ooh!
Mercy.
So when you think about a nation that is so angry that there is a competent, effective Black man in the White House, that just drove that rage toward getting in there a full-blown white nationalist. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's an intro.
Let's not ease our way in. Let's jump in with both feet for sure.
Ease on down the road.
That's it.
Can you take us back a little bit to why do you care about this? How did you come to find yourself as a historian focused on policy and the history of policy? Why do you care?
I care because of how I grew up and where I grew up. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and it was watching my neighborhood devolve into the hood and knowing that the people who lived there were checking all of the Americana boxes, God-fearing, hardworking, loved their families, did everything that they were supposed to do. And that was not enough to see the destruction of that community, to see the disinvestment in that community, to see the fleeing of grocery stores, seeing the schools not function, and seeing the lack of responsiveness of the governing bodies to the desolation that was happening in that community. So watching the city basically abandon that community and then hearing the news go on the Near East Side today, and making the ills that were emanating out of that community being described as solely based on individual choices. And not on the kind of systemic racism that community faced. That's where my vision, my anger, my drive to understand this thing really comes from. When you're seeing folks who are doing everything that they're supposed to do, and they are getting mowed down.
I can't imagine that you want to spend your time immersed in the things that you're teaching us about. And I also feel like you don't have a choice. This feeling like a mission, right? Can you talk a little bit about like how that feels?
To those to whom much is given, much is required. And I really believe that I have the responsibility to make this chaos visible so that we can understand what it is and why it is. I really have the belief that if we can bring this solid evidence to the vast majority of Americans, they will want the kind of America that this nation says it is instead of what it currently is. And so that's why I keep doing this work.
Well, I just want to thank you for following your mission because, again, I can't imagine the burden, the load.
I used to have black hair.
Pushed you gray. That's
and
fair.
I love you. I love you. And thank you. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for doing this work.
Yeah. Can we kind of situate the Brown decision, dive into the history a little bit there? Because I think about the things that I was taught about the Brown decision, it came out of nowhere. It was sort of white benevolence that said, okay, finally, we will let the moral arc of the universe bend a little more out of the goodness of our hearts as white people. But it really was a very concerted effort, starting all the way back with Charles Hamilton Houston and the NAACP starting way back in the 30s. Can you kind of take us back through the lead up to Brown?
Yes. Whew. So remember, we had the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, separate but equal. So these southern states were just like, Lord, separate, yes. And they hopped on that with a quickness, as my brother would say. It was that smaller word equal. They were like, equal. That they really, that just, it just was not resonating at all. And so you had these dual school systems where you had funding for white children's education that was like exponentially higher than the funding for black children. You had where there were no black high schools sometimes. And so that the schooling for black children would end like at the 8th grade. By the time we were in the 1940s, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and South Carolina all had more than 50% of their adult black population having fewer than 6 years of Jim Crow education. This was the landscape that Charles Hamilton Houston was looking at in the 1930s. He was like, if they want separate but equal, then Lord, they're getting ready to get it.
Right.
And it was equal that was the Achilles heel in that constitutional framing. And so he went after you. If you want separate, you're going to have to pay for equal. And so you saw this really deliberate strategy to compel these states to deal with equal. After they had really laid the platform for how unable these states were to meet that benchmark, then they went after, well, so what you can see is that separate but equal doesn't work. And that the ruling itself is unconstitutional. And so they glommed together several cases out of Delaware, out of South Carolina, out of Kansas. That was the Topeka Board of Education. And they went for it. And what you saw is that as these states like South Carolina saw this thing coming down the pike, you had them going, okay, we're going to do equal. We're going to do equal. And so they started pouring money into trying to build high schools for Black children in the 1950s. Mm-hmm. Now I'm like, how long you been doing this and you couldn't figure out that you needed to have high schools for Black children until the NAACP is coming down the pike going, we got you. And the thing was, NAACP, back off of this case, get rid of this case, and you too can have high schools for Black children. And the NAACP called them gilded cages of segregation. It said, no, we're not doing that. Mm-hmm. We're not doing that.
Mm-hmm. So you had the white power structure saying basically separate but equal. Yeah, that's great, assuming we don't actually have to do equal. We can focus on the separate but not the equal.
Yes.
And so the NAACP says, no, you know what? Actually, separate is the problem.
Right.
And they say, fine. Okay, we'll do equal. And the NAACP said basically, no, like we're not going to take this. We're not going to accept your equal. We are actually going to fight to get rid of separate entirely. And that was what led to the Brown case and this really monumental decision. Is that right?
Yes. When the case came down, Black folks were joyous because it felt like this nation, I mean, it was a 9-0 decision, a unanimous decision coming out of the U.S. Supreme Court. It felt like validation for African-American citizenship, for their full citizenship, that they had beaten Jim Crow by having decades of mobilization, decades of organizing, decades of finding folks who were willing to challenge the segregation in their schools, and knowing the kind of pressure that the white community was putting on these Black plaintiffs. Mm-hmm. The reverend who led the case in South Carolina, they called in his mortgage, they fired him, they fired his wife, they fired his family. It was to create just such kind of economic devastation, economic tolls on their lives. If you really want this thing, it's going to cost you. Mm-hmm. So you had these leaders who were taking on enormous pressure to get to the Brown decision. Brown was like, woo, we have overcome. Oh, Kalu Kalei, what a glorious day. Right?
I'd like you to read to me. Just read to me. Just
story
please.
Time.
That's it, please.
But the South was prepared for massive resistance. Yep. We are prepared to shut these school systems down. Now, you might think to yourself, they're going to shut down the entire school systems and nobody's going to get an education? No, because they knew white parents weren't having that. Mm-hmm. And so what they set up is that coming out of state dollars, they would pay for the tuition for white children to go to all white private segregated academies. And so if you look at the South, one of the things that you will see in this time frame is the creation of a slew of these white private academies. This was the need that was coming out of Brown. You know, the I will not have my child sitting next, as Eisenhower said, to some big Negro. And I'm like, look, if they're both 6 years old, I'm here to tell you, this isn't a big burly Negro.
Right. Right.
Oh, but then I think about the work that Philip Atiba Goff has done in psychology, which shows that Black children are viewed as older and less innocent than white children of the same age. And so it is that narrative that we're still dealing with today. What we see in Brown, though, is this joyous moment of where Black folks think that they have gained full American citizenship. And then you have what I call that white rage backlash. And we often think of rage as being violent. But when I'm talking about white rage, I'm talking about the slew of policies, that bureaucratic violence that is put in place to undermine African Americans' attainment of their citizenship rights. And that bureaucratic violence is the shutting down of the public school system and then providing funding for white children and nothing for Black children.
Do you think that the courts were willing to agree to equal because there was never a threat to power? Or what exactly led the white power structure to actually change?
I think that one of the things that we saw in Brown was that you had a shift in the zeitgeist, a shift in the kinds of international norms. Remember, we're coming out of the Holocaust. We're coming out of the Nuremberg trials. And we've got a sense of how deadly and lethal white supremacy is as a governing operating principle, how illegitimate and dangerous it is. You also have the Cold War. And the Cold War is where the U.S. is doing its strut on the international stages. We are the leader of the free world. We are against those really bad communists over there, that Soviet Union that denies their people their freedom. Then when you're reading through Pravda and Izvestia, which are the government communication organs for the Soviet Union, they harp on every lynching. They harp on every Black diplomat who comes to the U.S. and is hit with Jim Crow, where they can't get a hotel room, where they're thrown out of a restaurant, they're thrown out of a theater because they weren't sitting in the colored section, right? And the Soviets are like, so this is the democracy that they're trying to give to you. This is what they're bringing. And remember, we're also in the age of decolonization at this moment, too, where nations in Asia and Africa are gaining their independence. And the U.S. is trying to woo them into the West. So when you see Little Rock and you see that picture of those angry housewives hollering at Elizabeth Eckford, the Soviets had a field day with that. They're like, this is the democracy that the Americans want to bring to you. Look how they treat their own Black folk. What do you think they're going to do to you? This was part of what was driving that Brown decision. This is why Chief Justice Earl Warren was lobbying so hard to make it a 9-0 decision, because it was so important for U.S. foreign policy that this be a unanimous decision.
Not for the rights of Black kids.
Right.
Not for the education of Black kids.
So I'm like, Dr. Anderson, are you telling me like this had nothing to do with Black kids at all? Oh my gosh. No.
I mean, well, they knew that it was a stain on American democracy. They knew it was really hard for the U.S. to do its strut across the world stage. You cannot be the Jim Crow leader of the free world.
Right.
One of these things is not like the other.
Right.
This was the imperative that was pushing this.
So this was the imperative, this push for full citizenship rights. Finally, the court says, okay, separate is in fact inherently unequal, but this was at least in part due to foreign policy concerns, not so much for the rights of Black kids. So, maybe the result works out, but the reasoning wasn't quite what we would hope. Right. But the case was in fact decided 9-0 in 1954. Like what happened? How was that not the beginning of change? How did Brown get, quote, burnt to the ground, as your chapter in White Rage is called? Because I mean, it feels like it started pretty much right away.
You get the implementation decision in 1955. Which just says, with all deliberate speed.
Right.
Now, work with me here. 1865, we have the end of the Civil War. We've got Reconstruction. Then we get the collapse of Reconstruction, the Redemption era, and then the Jim Crow era. There have been decades to get this thing right. All deliberate speed to the folks who gave you the violence of Reconstruction, who gave you the Redemption era, who gave you Jim Crow, where you had on average a lynching every other day for 3 decades. All deliberate speed to these folks who have vowed that they will shut this thing down.
And that's how you end up in 1963. I think you're right. Not one Black kid went to school with a white kid in South Carolina, Alabama, or Mississippi 9 years after Brown v. Board passed. Right. 9 years after the Supreme Court supposedly said it is constitutionally not allowed to have separate education.
Right.
All deliberate speed for my grandmother, who desegregated her school as an educator, was 1973. She was the first Black educator at her school in Southwest
Wow.
Florida.
That's what I mean. So remember after the 1896 Plessy decision, the states moved with a quickness to implement Jim Crow through everything. So you had separate Bibles to swear on in court. You had separate Coke machines. You had separate cemeteries. I mean,
I have family members in still segregated cemeteries. And like the idea that we have to do that, it's beyond anything I can comprehend.
Right. And it gives you some sense of how steeped in racism, steeped in the values of segregation these states are. So just to say, with all deliberate speed, Thurgood Marshall and God love a duck, just... Okay, that's not a direct Thurgood Marshall quote, but you could basically hear him saying that, right? And he was just like, you let him off the hook. Yeah. You didn't give them a timetable. You didn't put any kind of mechanism in there to compel them to do this. But what you did have, you had the State Department sending out to all of the embassies and to all of the consulates, woo, hooray, look at us, we have overcome. This is the ability of democracy to perfect itself. I mean, so it was this wonderful PR campaign. But then the reality of it is that you did not have Black children getting a quality education. But the way that we tell this story is that between Brown and the Civil Rights Movement, we have overcome and all of the barriers have been removed. And this is the land of equal opportunity.
Right. We were racist. We had Brown. Now we're not racist. Story's over.
Right. Right. It's like Ernest Angley laying on hands. You are healed.
So we've talked a little bit about this before, but just the continued struggle for Black parents and caregivers to put their students in integrating schools when they would be one of few, and how, while we can celebrate Brown for what it did accomplish, it also really ripped apart the supportive Black education that students were receiving.
Absolutely. One of my colleagues is Professor Vanessa Siddle Walker.
Love her.
Isn't she fabulous?
She's amazing. Yeah.
I mean, it's just like to sit at her feet. Wow.
Yeah.
And the work she has done on these Black school networks, and what she's unpacking there is that the support, despite the lack of resources, the love that these teachers poured into these students, the belief system that these teachers poured into these students, that you can fly. Wow. And that Brown ripped that apart. The vast majority of Black teachers were fired.
Right.
And so we got the worst of both worlds. So that these Black children who had been in these under-resourced schools but were surrounded by networks of support were then placed into these white schools where there were resources, but they were denied access to those resources, and those places were absolutely hostile to their very being. So you lost the supportive network and you lost the access to those who believed in you. Think about how few Black students are in AP courses. How few Black students are in IB curriculum. How few. I mean, you just keep looking at this. I think about me. I'll do a little quick bio here. My junior high was like 99.9999999% Black, right? There were 3 white students in my entire junior high. Then I went to Brookhaven, which was basically an all-white school. There were those of us who were bussed in. It was so clear we were not wanted there. It was so clear. That's why there's so much work that needs to be done within these schools. I think about these battles that are happening and how so much of it is really wrapped in that white rage policy that these Black children don't deserve education. They don't have the merit to be educated. it is pouring good resources after bad
right.
to educate these children.
So, white supremacy is really crafty. And
yes, Lord. Oh, you're going to testify up in here, aren't you?
Well, and so can we ever successfully use legislation to have justice? Or is it going to always be a fight like this because white rage and white supremacy is so crafty?
We can use legislation and it will always be a fight. So the answer to your question is yes.
Yes.
So I look at the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the landmark pieces of legislation emerging out of the civil rights movement. And this legislation worked. In the early 1960s, only 6.7% of age-eligible Black folks were registered to vote in Mississippi. And Mississippi got some Black folk. So
right.
You only have, right? So 6.7%. 2 years after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, it was almost 60%. You started seeing this legislation work, doing what it was supposed to do. You also saw the white rage backlash to it, continuing to figure out how to undermine the Voting Rights Act, how to curtail the access to the ballot box for Black American citizens. How do we stop them from voting and do it legally? And this is what leads us into Shelby County v. Holder, that looks at the success of Barack Obama's election, that leads Chief Justice John Roberts to say, oh, that racism is a racism of the past. I mean, look, we've got more Black elected officials. We have more Hispanic elected officials. We have overcome. This is some old, antiquated stuff.
Right.
And dismantled the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. And so legislation can work. The price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
You hear that, Andrew?
Yep. Yep. No rest.
No rest. It means that we're always paying attention. It means that we're paying attention right now to this horrific assault, a white rage assault, particularly coming out of the 2020 election and coming out of the massive protests for the killing of George Floyd. And so what it looks like, I call it by land, sea, and air. Land is the assault on voting rights based on the big lie of massive rampant voter fraud. And this big lie has been disproven 8 ways to Sunday, but it becomes foundational for the measures that these states are putting in place to stop access to the ballot box. Land. C is the legislation that is coming through to wipe away and to penalize the teaching of accurate American history. What that does is it sets the framework. Who made this nation? Who built this nation? Who are the makers and who are the takers? And when you're able to define so many Americans as takers, as leeches, as parasites, you're allowed to frame policy on that framework. And if you have a history that is a mishistory, then it provides the kind of cognitive framework that makes that policy seem reasonable. That's what this is designed to do. Then we've got by air. And that is the wave of legislation that is loosening up gun laws. So getting rid of background checks, getting rid of licensing. At the same time, while you have the language that political violence is acceptable, that it is a legitimate political discourse. So all of these things are fused together on a platform of anti-Blackness. On a platform that Black people are the threat to this society. How do we block them out? At the ballot box, from our national memory, and through violence. Yeah.
That's scary.
Yes.
We're not solving racism this episode, Andrew.
we were supposed to.
But this is why we fight. This is why we fight.
Yeah.
And it's knowing that these things look disparate, right? So you hear the talk about voting rights, and it's over here on this shelf. And you hear the talk about the anti-1619 project and the anti-critical race theory. And we don't want to teach divisive topics that will make white children feel uncomfortable. And then you hear the piece over here about gun laws. And we've got to defend ourselves. So they sound like they're three separate things, but they're all interconnected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Typically, and I think you mentioned, like, white rage is not usually interpersonal violence, but it's just working within the system to create more violent structures. That there was a way in which that sort of stopped working. That, you know, the election of Barack Obama was one piece of it, and then certainly, like, Trump not getting reelected was another way that all of this agitating within the system, white people just sort of lost their minds. And I think that's how we then end up with January 6th, whereas previous versions of white rage may not have shown themselves. There was no need for white people to go and storm the Capitol when the Capitol was willing to sort of acquiesce to their will. And as soon as the system said, no, we're not going to do this anymore, people lost their mind. We're like, well, no, we have to force it. We're going to show up with the Confederate flag into the Senate.
Right. And think about it as well. In the rise of Jim Crow, the laws were written race neutrally, but they were racially targeted. But what you also had with the violence that was happening is that they knew that Black folks had tasted citizenship. And so what it was going to take to push Black people back in their place was this basically state-sanctioned violence. And so it's when the state approves of this violence, or wink, winks, nod, nod, Bob's your uncle at the violence. So it is, oh, these were just tourists. This was just a tourist visit on January 6th. This was legitimate political discourse.
Right.
So it is that policy approval of the violence that gives it the air to breathe. When you don't have accountability in the system, it runs rampant. Yeah.
And that's sort of what we saw in the wake of Brown as well, right? I mean, you talk about the shift from massive resistance to passive resistance, that we sort of changed language. I think about Elizabeth McCrae's Mothers of Massive Resistance, and this kind of the idea that we changed the language to be more race neutral. We changed the language to have this kind of vibe of respectability, that these are, you know, oh, he's a senator, like he's saying these things. It must be legitimate and part of the national discourse in a legitimate way. And then that kind of creates a permission structure particularly for white folks who may not feel particularly tied to that. I mean, one of the challenges of not knowing our real history is, like, we don't feel connected to those threads. We say that was then and this is now. And then it allows it to continue in kind of a race neutral context, but with the same outcomes.
Wunderbar. I mean, nailed it in one. I mean, so it is where we talk about freedom of choice. We talk about neighborhood schools. Who could be against neighborhood schools? Who could be against freedom of choice? I mean, these are bedrock American values. It's Americana. It is amber waves of grain. It's the language that is used to cover white rage, to make it acceptable. It's what Lee Atwater, who was a political strategist for Ronald Reagan, said. In 1954, you could use the N-word, and it didn't hurt you. By 1968, you couldn't. It backfired. And so we started talking about more abstract things like taxes or forced busing or states' rights. And he said, and the whole point of that was that Blacks get hurt worse than whites. And so you think of that framing is that Blacks get hurt worse than whites. It means that whites are collateral damage in these policies, because then whites who get hurt with these policies become the fig leaf to cover that. No, how could this be a racist policy? White folks got hurt too.
Yeah,
there are white people in jail. Our criminal justice isn't discriminatory against Black people. There are white people in jail. There are white people in under-resourced schools. So
the whole point is that Blacks get hurt worse than whites. And so when you see that as a public policy framework, what you see is white rage operationalizing itself.
Have you figured out why we need to hurt Blacks worse than anybody else?
Okay, that means you got to read the Second Amendment book.
Okay. All right. Okay, I will find the strength to do that.
But it really deals with this inherent fear, almost visceral, of Black people as a threat to white society, to the white community. We see this coming out of slavery. You see it in the slave codes. You see it in the laws that they created in the 17th century, in the 18th century, that were about how do we protect ourselves from these folks. Because they're violent, they're inherently criminal, they're uncivilized, they're savage. You had, right after Gabriel's revolt in 1800 in Virginia, you had one Virginian talking about, if we are going to keep a ferocious monster among us, we have to keep it in chains. And so this is the through line that then has Michael Brown being described as a monster, that has Eric Garner being described as a beast, that has the defense attorney in the Ahmaud Arbery killing describing him with his long, dirty toenails, which is to say a beast, right? This is the through line.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think it's easy to see those as kind of extreme examples. And, in some ways, I guess they are. I feel easy to distance myself from those, but it also shows up in what you were talking about earlier in the adultification of Black kids, in the ways that we view a white kid acting out as needing a little more structure or maybe needing to exercise a little more, and a Black kid acting out as being a sign of criminality. Yeah. These sort of subtler, less extreme versions of it that then end up replicating the same thing.
Exactly. There was a scholar out of the University of Washington, and he found that in a computer simulation, when Blacks and whites were dressed the same and doing the same thing, officers shot Black folks more than they shot white folks. It was the Blackness that created the threat, that created the danger. And so when you believe threat, danger, uncivilized, savage, beast, criminal, why they can't be among us, why they can't be in our schools.
I need you to get your people, Andrew. I don't.
I know. Yeah.
This is on you. This is on you. This has nothing to do with me. This has nothing to do with Dr. Anderson. This is all you. This is all you.
There is something, and yeah, to your point, Val, this is probably not the right panel to try to figure this out, but I think, and you point out, Dr. Anderson, you're right, white rage has undermined democracy, warped the Constitution, weakened the nation's ability to compete economically, squandered billions of dollars on baseless incarceration, rendered an entire region sick, poor, and woefully undereducated, and left cities nothing less than decimated. All this havoc has been wreaked simply because African Americans wanted to work, get an education, live in decent communities, raise their families, and vote, because they were unwilling to take no for an answer. And think about Heather McGhee and the Sum of Us, we actually could all be better off if we did away with this.
Yep.
Yes.
And yet there is this constant fear and this constant threat. And I think to believe all those things, you have to believe in the full humanity of Black people.
Right.
And if you believe in the full humanity of Black people and you look at the history of Black people in this country, there is a tension that is hard to reconcile for white people. And I can't ask either of you to opine on what that is.
I definitely don't know.
But it seems like there is something there, I think, about Resma Menachem and my grandmother's hands and kind of the generational trauma that also white people are carrying, and in this kind of challenge of reconciling the history with what could actually be a much more powerful and hopeful future.
Right. We talked about the January 6th insurrection, and I talked about this in One Person, No Vote in the epilogue. After the 2016 election, what you're seeing are two different visions of America. One vision is for a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multicultural, vibrant democracy. And we're like, whoo, that thing's got swag.
That sounds so beautiful.
Right? That thing is like, dang, what's my name?
That's
just it. Really just
USA.
Right? And then there is the Trumpian Herrenvolk democracy, which wants to replicate basically apartheid South Africa because they're seeing the demographic shift. And so it's to have a large rightless labor pool that's generating enormous resources. But those resources flow up into a small strata of whites who govern, who rule, but who have the veneer of a democracy because there are so-called elections. That's the vision. That's what this battle is about. So when you get this erasure of the history, so that you can't talk about Jim Crow, you can't talk about slavery, you can't talk about the dispossession, you can't talk about the Bracero program, you can't talk about the National Origins Act of 1924. When you have the assault on the ballot box that works to just make it much more difficult for this burgeoning age-eligible population to be able to vote, it is designed to create this Herrenvolk democracy. And part of this work that we're doing as educators is to help folks imagine. In White Rage, that was that last chapter, imagine. And it was to imagine what this nation could be if we educated all of our children. Wow. Imagine what this nation could be if the billions that we funnel into a carceral state were actually deployed to support families and communities so that they could fly. Imagine what we could be if we had elected representatives who were actually representative of the populations, right? And so what they were responding to was climate change. What they were responding to was a vastly unequal criminal justice system. What they were responding to was the need for real safety and real security in this nation. So our babies wouldn't have to have shooter drills in their schools. Right. Imagine. Because if you can't imagine it, you can't even fight for it. You know, I get questions like, how do you keep fighting? Where's your hope in? Because, I mean, it really looks like I'm looking into the abyss.
That was literally my next question. My next question was exactly that. Yep.
And I think about how the enslaved had to imagine freedom when there was nothing around them that told them they could be free.
Yeah.
How they imagined what being able to hold on to their babies looked like. Having their families together and not being sold on the auction block. They had to imagine that when around them there was so much that told them, oh, that's not what you do. That's not who you are. The power of that imagining led to incredible resistance. And not just when we think about the revolts like Nat Turner or Denmark Vesey or Gabriel, but it's also the way that they defied. They broke their tools. They put rocks in the bags instead of putting cotton. Sell that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They went to the courts. They ran away. Imagining freedom. Yeah.
I also think about, and I was fortunate enough to just see the Fisk Jubilee Singers. I mean, it was just this unbelievable program this weekend. Took my kids. It was amazing. And they really tapped into this view of resistance as Black joy, this view of resistance as art, as music, as culture, that holding on to all that through that. Because I mean, you talk about that's not what you do, but that's not what you do. That's not what your parents did. That's not what your grandparents did. That's not what your great-grandparents did. The generations and generations and generations to be able to hold on to that.
Yeah, I mean, Black joy is just such a powerful tool of resistance. And so when you read through the stuff in the era of Jim Crow, they're talking about these are people without a history. They don't have any culture. So it is a way to erase that. And that's what we're seeing today, an attempt to erase that. They don't have a history. They don't have a culture. They made no contributions. And so seeing the laughter, seeing the artistic production, seeing the cultural productions, that's how I hold on. is that I think about my great-great-grandfather who was enslaved, and he fell in love with an enslaved woman who lived on the plantation next door. And he told his master that he was not going to work unless he could be with her. Now, I want you to think about how, what is the word I can use? Chutzpah.
For real. For real. Yeah.
Because he could be killed. And he was like, I love her. And I'm not going to work until I can be with her. She loves me. And so his master bought her and brought her over onto the plantation. And then my great-grandfather, after he did his work as an enslaved man, he hired himself out to make enough money to buy her freedom and his. Then they got the hell out of Tennessee. But again, the power to imagine freedom.
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about imagining what a vibrant, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-religious democracy America can be. Wow.
Yeah.
And, you know, and nobody's done this before.
Right.
You're right.
Right?
We're writing the book.
We're writing the book.
I was thinking about both that imagination that's necessary and the power of that sacrificial love of your great-grandparents that was part of that. Like, that type of energy source is sustaining.
Yes.
So that's dope.
Yes. Yes. And so when you talk about pulling on the power of the ancestors.
Yeah.
And it's like when I teach the civil rights movement, seeing folks like Amasio Snipes, right?
Yep.
Who came back from the Second World War and
He was in Georgia, correct?
Georgia, 1946,
Yep.
with a heavily racist campaign being waged. And there's a sign over the polling place that says the first Negro that votes, that'll be the last thing he ever does. And he's like, I fought fascist. And he went in and he cast his vote. He was the only Black person to vote in Taylor County, Georgia, in the 1946 election. Several days later, a firing squad showed up and mowed him down. But I think about that courage, knowing that the killing spree was on. They made it really clear, you vote, you die. And this democracy that he had fought so hard for was worth it. That's the history they don't want us teaching.
Right.
Right.
And I'm thinking about how if we have those historical gaps in our knowledge, then we don't see the need to imagine a better way because it's already been painted as beautiful and necessary and right. And so to lose even the desire to imagine is, I think, one of the greatest losses that we're fighting.
Exactly. And so one of the things, as I say, is that America is an aspirational nation. Part of the problem we have is that you have a large swath of folk who want to treat that aspiration as an achievement, as we've already got here. And so if we've already done this, and we've done this from the founding fathers, what are y'all talking about?
Right.
Right.
What are you talking about? There's no need for this legislation. There's no need to change anything that we've already done. We've already attained greatness.
We just have to be great again.
See, we was having a good conversation.
You're wrong.
I'm so grateful to you, Dr. Anderson, for keeping that vision alive, for pushing through, for finding that well of hope to draw from to keep doing the work that you're doing, because I think it's so important. It's certainly enriched my life in innumerable ways. White Rage, in particular, just totally changed the way I view the world. I'm really grateful for it and for all the work that you do.
And I love you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Really grateful for your time.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So back in October of 2024, Val, what do you think?
You know, for whatever reason, I don't go back a lot to listen to our old episodes, right?
Yeah.
You know, we're always working on the next thing, and actually revisiting that episode took me back to a time, you know, and I feel like I have certainly grown in my understanding of our nation, of our practiced values, of what it looks like to be on the receiving end from a policy standpoint of white rage policies, to be able to try to like work through and try to keep progress going. Even, for example, in our podcast, we're like, how do we keep encouraging people not only to just learn, but to do and to take action around these really important things? And I apparently have some unresolved trauma around elections.
Yeah.
You'll listen to this a couple of days before the election, but you and I have had the opportunity to vote already.
Yes.
We're very proud of being voters. However we do that, whether it's going to the polls for early voting or casting our mail-in ballots, it's something that I honestly couldn't wait to do.
Yeah.
And I couldn't wait to do that because I feel like it is as much our responsibility as eligible voters in the country to make our voices heard around what our values are.
Yeah.
And I think we have more than enough evidence and also more than enough feelings of alarm to know that this is another serious election.
Yes, that feeling of election trauma is real. It certainly feels like the stakes always feel high. They feel particularly high right now. I was very grateful to, in Colorado, it's so easy to vote. We get our ballots in the mail, do our research, fill out the ballot, take it to a drop box. There was one 3 blocks from my house. I channeled some of that anxiety into filling out my ballot and turning it in as soon as I could. Feel good about that. Encourage everybody to make a plan for how you're going to vote, when you're going to vote, where you're going to vote, make sure that it actually happens. And then, what do you do with the rest of that anxiety? You find whatever places you can to encourage people to go out and vote. So part of why we wanted to rerun this episode was to encourage all of you listeners to make sure you go out and vote, make sure you have your voice heard, because certainly voting alone is not going to fix the things that ail this country. But it is an important first step in making sure that your voice is heard and making sure that the choices that we are making as a country reflect our values as a country.
That's right. I think another parallel step, and this goes back to Dr. Anderson, is a knowledge of the history that brought us to this place.
Yeah.
And you always hear that the past is prologue, the past is prologue. And I never really connected with that saying until actually just this weekend. I was thinking about what would be the future of this prologue that we're living in right now.
Once this is the past, what is it prologue to?
Yes. And I think that is a decision that we get to make.
Yes.
I think one reason I didn't connect with the saying before is because I didn't associate it with action that I could take now.
There's an inevitability. If the past is prologue, then it is telling us what's going to happen. What say do I have in it?
Right. But we actually get to write the story. So the prologue of this story can be, there was a time in our country where we were super hopeful, thought we had reached racial nirvana, only to find ourselves in the midst of legislative white rage wherever we looked, whether it was banning histories or banning books.
Yeah.
And we had another opportunity to make a choice about who we wanted to be as a country, who we wanted to be together. And regardless of how this election turns out, we get to make that choice.
Yeah.
And we get to decide who we are raising our kids to be, who we decide to be in community with, how we decide to show love for one another.
Yes. There is a choice in the next week here about what kind of country we want to have. And the story that gets written will be written in a way that is far less nuanced than how the actual voting plays out. Regardless of what happens, the story will be told as we made a really clear choice. But We know that this election is going to come down to a small number of people in a small number of places. And it's going to come down to, the work that goes into knocking on doors, to making phone calls, to getting people to the polls. And it's going to be decided at the margins. And we're a largely divided country. And so I certainly hope that things go the way that I would like for them to go, and know that even if they do, that does not mean that we get to then kick back and relax. That does not mean that we have solved the problems that are facing us in terms of division, in terms of, building a true multiracial democracy. We do not fix that problem or make that problem entirely unfixable with the outcome of this election. We do that in the work that we do every single day, in building community, in figuring out who is the we that we think we are part of, in figuring out who are we going to be in community with, who are we going to lock arms with and try to make the world a better place with. And this is an important moment to do that in the best way that we can. And it doesn't solve all the problems alone, and it doesn't mean that all the problems are unsolvable regardless of how the election goes.
That's right. I know that there are folks that are disenfranchised out there. I know there are folks that are disengaged out there. And so I want to encourage those of us who are engaged, who are not disenfranchised, to not waste the opportunity.
Yeah.
To be that voice.
Absolutely. That quote from Dr. Anderson, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance, right? Like we have to be vigilant, especially vigilant coming up to an election, but we have to be vigilant immediately after the election as well. And I think there's an aspirational quality to our country, to the words that we have in our founding documents, to the kind of ideals that we like to hold up, particularly to other countries around the world that we have never really actually lived up to. We haven't achieved it, right? Like that aspirational version of our country is something that we have not yet achieved. And this election is a chance to say, there is a version that we would like to continue to work towards achieving. We're not going to achieve it with this election, but we would like to continue to work towards achieving that. And that's the vision of the country that I hope folks will, take with them when they go to the polls, and actually go to the polls in order to say, like, yeah, we're not there yet, but we'd like to be.
Yeah. Just know, listeners, that Andrew and I will be on the other side of this, still having these conversations with you, still trying to navigate what it means to do this work in every context together. Yeah. And that's what we're committed to.
Yep. We'll be here. We will not be here the day after the election, but we will be here 2 weeks from today, if you're listening to this on the release date, with some more great conversations. So grateful that we got to have Dr. Anderson on. It was 2.5 years ago, but still feels so totally relevant.
Wow.
If you have not yet checked out her books, she has so many books. They are all incredible. She also has recently released a number of young reader versions of White Rage, of The Second, which is her book about guns. The young reader versions are great. So if you have not yet read her work, or your kids have not, be sure to grab those and pass them along. There'll be links in the show notes to those.
Also, we want to encourage you. Obviously, this episode might not be age appropriate for our younger kids, but you can certainly still talk about these big ideas with your children. I know my kids were very young at the first election of President Barack Obama. But we were still able to find ways to talk about it as engaged citizens. We were always active, voting, donating to issues that matter to us. And so it gave us an opportunity to talk about things that were important. And so we encourage you to answer any questions your children may have about what is happening, why people might be feeling a certain way, what they're seeing on TV. We encourage you to explore those conversations with them.
Yeah, there will be lots of big emotions going on, and our kids will certainly be aware of that. And so giving them some context to understand it will definitely be important.
Yep.
Whew. Well, here it goes.
Here we go.
We'll see what happens. Our only call to action for you today, listeners, is to go vote. Find your polling place if you've not already. Make a plan. Bring a friend. Go and make sure your voice is heard.
That's right.
Val, it is a pleasure as always, an honor as always to be in this with you as I try to know better and do better.
Until next time.